Why is Toyota, the company that practically invented the concept of the 300,000-mile car, now telling owners of the new 2026 Camry Hybrid, the 2026 Corolla, and the newest RAV4 to put an oil in their engines that has the consistency of water? And why are so many veteran mechanics and long-term owners convinced that this move toward ultra-low viscosity 0W8 oil is a recipe for a mechanical disaster that will kill engine longevity before the car even sees its 10th birthday? If you have been looking at the oil cap on a brand new Toyota and felt a genuine sense of panic seeing that 0W8 or 0W16 specification, you are not alone. And your skepticism is not just a refusal to accept new technology. By the time you finish this breakdown, you will understand the real engineering trade-off Toyota is making between fuel economy and engine protection. You will uncover the hidden factor of oil dilution that makes 0W8 specifically dangerous for hybrid drivers who do a lot of short trips, and you will learn the exact maintenance strategy that can actually save your engine from a premature trip to the scrapyard, regardless of what the dealership manual says. If you want car content that treats you like an adult with a brain and a budget, rather than just another consumer to be marketed to, take a second to hit that subscribe button, tap the notification bell, and share this video with the person in your life who still thinks 10W30 is the only oil worth using. To understand why the 0W8 oil disaster is such a massive talking point right now, you have to look at the global context of why oil is getting thinner in the first place, because this is happening in the US, Europe, Asia, and Australia for the exact same reason. Governments worldwide have set increasingly impossible fuel economy and emissions targets, often referred to as CAFE standards in the States or Euro 7 in Europe. For a manufacturer like Toyota to avoid billions of dollars in fines, they have to find every possible way to reduce internal engine friction. One of the easiest ways to do that is to use thinner oil, because a thinner oil requires less energy for the oil pump to move and creates less drag on the crankshaft and pistons as they move through the engine. In a testing lab, switching from 0W20 to 0W8 might only net a fractional increase in miles per gallon, but when you multiply that across millions of vehicles sold globally, it is the difference between Toyota hitting its regulatory targets or failing them. However, a lot of experienced drivers and fathers who grew up on the boring but bulletproof Toyotas of the 90s and early 2000s are looking at 0W8 oil and asking a very legitimate question. How can an oil that thin actually protect metal parts at high temperatures and high loads? In the old days, we used 5W30 or 10W30 because those oils provided a thick film strength between moving parts, like bearings, piston rings, and camshafts. Film strength is what keeps metal from touching metal. The fear with 0W8 is that under extreme heat, such as driving across the Australian outback in summer or towing a trailer up a mountain grade in the American West, the oil will become so thin that the protective film will shear or break down, leading to direct metal-on-metal contact. For a generation that expects a Toyota to last 300,000 miles, the idea of using water oil feels like planned obsolescence disguised as environmental progress. I've spent enough time in service bays and looking at oil analysis reports to tell you that the hybrid factor makes this even more complicated, and this is where the 0W8 disaster really starts to take shape. In a 2026 Toyota Hybrid, the gasoline engine is constantly turning on and off. If you are driving in a city or in heavy traffic, the engine might fire up for only 60 seconds to charge the battery or provide a burst of power and then shut back down before it ever reaches its optimal operating temperature. When an engine runs cold, it produces more moisture and allows a small amount of unburnt fuel to leak past the piston wings and into the oil pan. This is called oil dilution. In an older car with thicker oil, a little bit of fuel dilution was manageable, but when you start with 0W8, which is already incredibly thin, and then you dilute it with raw gasoline, the viscosity drops even further, potentially turning your motor oil into something that has almost no lubricating properties left at all. This is the hidden factor that most dealerships never mention, and it is the primary reason why short-trip hybrid drivers are seeing increased engine wear at much lower mileages than we ever saw on the old gas-only Corollas and Camrys. This debate is raging globally because different regions handle this risk in very different ways. In the United States, Toyota is pushing the 0W8 and 10,000-mile oil change interval hard to keep the cost of ownership looking low on paper. However, if you look at Toyota manuals in other parts of the world, like Japan or parts of Europe, you'll often see severe service intervals that recommend changing the oil every 5,000 kilometers or 3,000 miles if you do frequent short trips or drive in extreme heat. Experienced drivers in Australia and the Middle East are particularly vocal about this because they know that 0W8 oil in 45 degrees Celsius heat is a massive gamble. The consensus among veteran mechanics is that the oil itself might be a masterpiece of chemical engineering, but the intervals Toyota is recommending are built for the first owner who leases the car for 3 years, not the second or third owner who wants the car to last 20 years. Now, let's look at the other side of the argument, because to be fair and accurate, we have to talk about why Toyota engineers claim this will actually work. Modern Toyota engines, like the dynamic force engines found in the 2026 hybrids, are built with incredibly tight micron-level tolerances. The gaps between the bearings and the crankshaft are much smaller than they were in a 1995 Camry. Toyota argues that a thicker oil, like 5W30, might actually be too thick to properly flow into those tiny gaps during a cold start, which would ironically cause more wear than the 0W8. They also use variable displacement oil pumps that are specifically calibrated to maintain pressure with these ultra-thin oils. So the pro-new tech argument is that the engine was designed for the oil, and as long as the chemistry of the synthetic additives is strong enough, the engine will be fine. But here is where the argument gets heated. Even if the engine is designed for it, the margin for error has basically vanished. In an old 22R-E Toyota engine, you could be a quart low on oil or go 2,000 miles over your change interval, and the engine would forgive you because it was over-engineered for durability. With a 2026 hybrid running 0W8, you have no margin. If you have a tiny bit of oil consumption or a little bit of fuel dilution, or you miss your service window by a few weeks, the thinness of the oil means you are much closer to the danger zone than drivers used to be. For fathers and pragmatic owners, that lack of a safety margin is exactly what they hate. They don't want a car that requires perfect conditions to reach high mileage. They want a car that can handle real-life neglect and still keep running. So what should you actually do if you find yourself owning one of these new 2026 hybrids and you want it to reach that legendary 300,000-mile mark? You have to ignore the marketing version of the maintenance schedule and follow the engineering version. Here is the practical keep and buy versus caution list for the 0W8 era. The maintenance must-dos for longevity. Change your 0W8 or 0W16 oil every 5,000 miles or 6 months, regardless of what the dashboard says. This is the only way to combat the fuel dilution issues inherent in hybrid systems. If you live in an extremely hot climate or tow frequently, talk to a trusted independent mechanic about whether a slightly higher viscosity oil, like 0W16 or 0W20, is appropriate for your specific region, as many international Toyota manuals still allow for this. Use only high-quality, full synthetic oils that meet the latest API, SP, and ILSAC GF6B standards, because the additive packages in these oils are what actually provide the protection when the oil film gets thin. Keep a close eye on your oil level every 2 weeks. These thin oils are more prone to burn off or evaporation, and running even half a quart low on 0W8 is far more dangerous than it was on older engines. The situations to approach with caution are: avoid extended life oil filters or 10,000-mile change intervals if you do 80% of your driving in the city or on short trips where the engine never gets hot enough to boil off moisture. Be wary of first-generation hybrid engines from brands that don't have Toyota's level of experience with thin oil lubrication, as they may not have the same variable oil pump technology to back it up. Don't assume that just because a car is a Toyota, it can handle the same level of maintenance neglect that your dad's 1990 pickup did. The 2026 models are precision instruments, not iron sledgehammers. When you break it all down, the 0W8 oil disaster isn't necessarily a failure of chemistry. It's a conflict of interest. Toyota's primary goal with 0W8 is to satisfy government regulators and hit fleet-wide fuel economy numbers. Your goal, as the person who actually paid for the car, is to make sure it doesn't need a $6,000 engine replacement in 8 years. Those two goals are moving in opposite directions. The reason dads and mechanics are shaking their heads is that they know the car industry has a history of promising that new and thinner is better, only for owners to find out decades later that the long-term durability just wasn't there. The reality is, 2026 Toyota hybrids can last 300,000 miles, but they won't do it on the default maintenance schedule provided by the dealership. It requires a more proactive, old-school approach to maintenance that accounts for the thinness of the oil and the complexity of the hybrid system. If you treat 0W8 like the high-performance, high-maintenance fluid it actually is, rather than a set-it-and-forget-it convenience, you can have the fuel economy of a modern hybrid without sacrificing the legendary reliability that made you buy a Toyota in the first place. Now, I want to hear from the mechanics and the high-mileage drivers in the comments. Have you seen any early signs of wear or oil consumption in these new ultra-low viscosity engines? And for the Toyota owners out there, are you sticking to the 10,000-mile interval, or are you changing it early? Let's get a real conversation going, because the data we share here is more honest than what you'll find in any sales brochure. If this engineering-focused perspective gave you a better perspective on your next car purchase, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive, and check out the video on your screen now where we break down why Toyota finally admitted their older engines were actually better. See you in the next one.